We recently had a guest speaker named Steve Ferry, and he gave a presentation about God's punishment of people. In our society, this idea has become pretty taboo to talk about openly. It's part of what makes Christianity seem so intolerant to many people. So this got us thinking, what other ideas from Christianity have become harder and harder to talk about? Some churches will just ignore offensive ideas, thinking that it'll maybe get more people in the doors. But I don't think this really works in the long run. Maybe that works at first, but it ends up creating a lot of cognitive dissonance later down the line once someone actually learns about the ideas later. And it's actually not how Jesus handled hard topics. He usually talked about them up front. Jesus says this, "Don't begin following me until you count the cost. For who would begin construction of a building without first calculating the cost to see if there's enough money to finish it?" There are some of you who are on the fence about Christianity. Maybe something in it has intrigued you. Maybe it's something about this community specifically that's making you want to give it a second look. But I want to be as upfront and open as possible about the potentially harder areas to accept, because I want you to be able to count the cost. I honestly think that any cost is worth following Jesus, but you should at least know what the costs are so you can make that decision for yourself. That being said, we're going to talk about a part of Christianity that is an especially hard pill to swallow. We're going to talk about evangelism. Evangelism is the act of sharing the gospel. It's something that we're commanded to do by Jesus himself as part of his broader command to make disciples. The Apostle Paul, who you might have heard of as Saint Paul, he says it this way: "If you openly declare that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For it is by believing in your heart that you are being made right with God, and it is by openly declaring your faith that you are saved." But how can they call on him to save them unless they believe in him? And how can they believe in him if they've never heard about him? And how can they hear about him unless someone tells them? And how will anyone go and tell them without being sent? That is why the scriptures say, "How beautiful are the feet of the messengers who bring good news." Christians today are those messengers that Paul was talking about, the ones charged with telling the world about the gospel. So evangelism, it's obviously a really important piece of being a Christian, but for people outside Christianity, evangelism can seem incredibly offensive. The general rule of thumb when it comes to religious freedom in America is that as long as your religion doesn't bother me, then you're fine to keep practicing it. What you do on your own time is your own business. But evangelism, it's the exact opposite of that. The point of it is to bother you and to try and get you to join the Christian team. Also, people today almost universally affirm that different cultures all have unique contributions and are equally valid forms of life. But most people think that no culture is better than another culture. But evangelism, to many people, is a direct denial of this. It seems like it's saying your culture is not as good as ours, and we want you to leave your culture to join ours. And then, to top it off, what's usually present in evangelistic conversations is the idea that the Christian God will judge non-Christians for not believing in Jesus, which hardly seems like a fair idea for most thoughtful people. Now, I think that some of these characterizations aren't actually good or fair representations of evangelism, but that's how it's perceived among non-Christians. And if you're listening to this and you're not a Christian, maybe you've thought these exact things. But before you go thinking that these are things that are only hard for you to accept, let me show you some statistics that describe how Christians view evangelism. While 80% of those who attend church one or more times a month believe they have a personal responsibility to share their faith, 61% have not told another person about how to become a Christian in the previous 6 months. 48% of church attendees have never invited an unchurched person to attend a church service or some other program at their church. These stats show that Christians aren't evangelizing. Why is this? Is it because it's so hard to do? Is it because they've given that responsibility to the church leaders and the staff members? Those both do play a part of it. But even more telling is this statistic. Almost half of millennials, 47%, agree at least somewhat that it is wrong to share one's personal beliefs with someone of a different faith in hopes that they will one day share the same faith. That's talking about Christians. It's not that it's only too hard. It's not only that it's someone else's job. It's just wrong. Many millennial Christians, and there's probably a majority of millennials watching this video, have bought into the broader cultural assumptions about tolerance and not pushing your beliefs on other people. So much so that they have altogether decided that evangelism is straight up wrong. And the other trends that we see for the next generation, called Generation Z, show that they would probably affirm this even more strongly than millennials do. There's probably a good chunk of Christians who are watching this who would maybe agree with this, but would be too afraid to admit it in most church settings. Before we go on, I want you to hear from me. This is not going to be a guilt trip. My desire is not to make you feel like you suck as a Christian, because I understand where you're coming from. I think that the way that we talk about the gospel, what is actually being shared in evangelism, has altogether stopped sounding like good news. And most of the time, evangelistic gospel presentations actually end up sounding kind of messed up. I want to talk about a version of sharing the gospel in evangelism that's pretty common. It may be the only way that you personally know how to explain the gospel. It usually goes something like this. Everyone has sinned, and so God is filled with wrath towards everyone. Jesus takes the wrath of God onto himself by dying on the cross, which was an early form of Roman execution. And so God's wrath is no longer on those whose faith is in Jesus. They are saved and will go to heaven when they die because the wrath of God is no longer pointed at them. It's been appeased. Unfortunately, everyone else is still under God's wrath, and they will all go to hell when they die for eternity. This version of the gospel sounds hardly like good news. It kind of sounds like A, God is like this angry, vengeful deity, and B, like Jesus and God are against each other. Like Jesus has to save us from God. God was waiting to wipe you out, but now that he's killed his own son, you can be on good terms with him, and you can call him Father and stuff like that. When it's framed like this, it sounds kind of messed up, doesn't it? N.T. Wright, he's a prominent theologian and Christian historian, and he put it this way in an interview. He said, we've taken John 3:16, which says, God so loved the world that he gave his only son, and turned it into, God so hated the world that he killed his only son. Maybe you haven't heard it expressed that explicitly, but maybe instead you've heard this version. You're on the stand in a courtroom, and you're guilty because of all the things you've ever done wrong. God is the judge, and the punishment for sin is death, which counterintuitively means an eternally long time in hell. But right as you're about to be sentenced, Jesus comes and says he'll take the punishment instead of you and will die in your place. Yet for him, his death only lasts 3 days when yours was going to be eternally long in hell. If you accept this offer, then you'll be saved and go to heaven when you die. But if you reject this offer, then you'll still have to pay the penalty that you deserved. Again, it doesn't really sound like good news. And it leaves a lot of people thinking, but I haven't done anything deserving of death. And Christians will usually say, yes, but God is so holy that even a tiny sin like swearing, stealing a cupcake is deserving of eternity in hell, which sounds kind of crazy. Also, the main thing that's important in this presentation is that Jesus died. His death is what satisfies the penalty that we deserved. But then why the heck did Jesus come back to life? Like the big thing that makes Christianity seem crazy to people is that we believe Jesus died and then came back to life, that he was resurrected. What's the point of that for people in this presentation of the gospel? It seems like we could have skipped that resurrection part altogether and the point would have been the same. God's wrath would have still been appeased and our penalty would have still been paid. These two presentations of the gospel can loosely be referred to as penal substitutionary atonement. It sounds a lot more complicated than it is, but it's basically the idea that Christ, by his own sacrificial choice, was punished or penalized in the place of sinners, substitution, thus satisfying the demands of justice so God can justly forgive sin. This concept and the example specifically of being in a courtroom, it should sound like more familiar territory to many of you who've grown up as Christians in America. This has been the dominant way of explaining why Jesus had to die on the cross for the last few hundred years, especially in countries like America in the West. But it doesn't really sound like good news, and it's no wonder that most millennials think it's wrong to share this good news. No wonder they've stopped evangelizing. But what most Christians don't know is that this is just one way of explaining the gospel. What missionaries, basically people who are professional evangelizers, will tell you, they'll tell you that it's incredibly important to understand the culture that you live in and try to show how the gospel answers that culture's deepest longings. For a long time, the deepest longings of America, of Americans living in the West, was to not feel guilty. Now, there's a ton of different reasons for why Americans feel so guilty, but we don't really have time to go into them. And so for a long time, the gospel was framed as a response to this internal shared feeling of guilt. And so this picture of the courtroom and being declared innocent was super popular in evangelism. But when you zoom out of the West, you find that other countries have different deepest longings. There's an article that shows while the people in the West operate under a guilt and innocence paradigm, the East is more focused on honor and shame. And parts of Africa and Latin America are more focused on the difference between fear and power. And what is most important for our conversation is that Americans don't feel guilty anymore. The culture has shifted. Christianity is no longer the dominant religious force it once was. And so our message of the gospel seems a lot like it's good news and more like bad news. Tim Keller, he's a prominent pastor. He was being interviewed on a podcast, and he said that people used to have all these spiritual dots. They internally felt guilty already outside of being a Christian. They believed that the meaning of life was to be a good person, and they generally believed in a heaven and a hell. But now things have changed. Now, this is part of the transcript of the podcast, which is why it's a little less polished. Tim says you can't evangelize today by saying, oh, you want to go to heaven when you die, right? And oh, you know you're not perfect, but Jesus died for your sins so that you can be sure if you believe in him that when you die, you'll go to heaven. That's assuming they know all the dots. But what if the dots aren't there? Now what do we do? The entire Western church for 1,000 years has assumed a Christendom culture. And now that it's gone, it has no way of reaching people, doesn't know how to talk to people and get their attention. I agree with him, and I honestly think that we would evangelize more if we had a better, more robust understanding of the gospel. Our gospel deficiency leads to an evangelism deficiency. It's easy to think about the gospel in a one-size-fits-all approach, but that's not how missionaries do it, and that's not how Paul himself did it. Paul adapted how he shared the gospel depending on the context that he was in. He wrote this in a letter to a church. He says, the gospel is seen as foolish to the Jews who ask for signs from heaven, and it is foolish to the Greeks who seek human wisdom. So when we preach that Christ was crucified, the Jews are offended and the Gentiles say it's all nonsense. Right here, Paul's saying that the cultural narrative, the deepest longings of the Jewish people was to gain power. And for the Greeks, their deepest longing was to acquire wisdom. But then Paul says, but to those called by God to salvation, both Jews and Gentiles, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. This foolish plan of God is wiser than the wisest of human plans, and God's weakness is stronger than the greatest of human strength. Paul's showing that the gospel fulfilled both these deepest longings of both cultures in different ways. And Paul would present the gospel differently depending on who he was speaking to. He says this, when I am with those who are weak, I share their weakness, for I want to bring the weak to Christ. Yes, I try to find common ground with everyone, doing everything I can to save some. I do everything to spread the good news and share in its blessings. If you think that the only way to explain the gospel is through telling people Jesus paid their debt or took the punishment that they deserved, then your gospel is too small. The gospel is more like a diamond. It's multifaceted, and when you turn it, it's beautiful in an endless number of ways. If you are not feeling up to the task of evangelism, you may need to spend some time learning or relearning other aspects of the gospel. And you may realize that you yourself have not been seeing it as good news anymore. Here's an alternate way of sharing the gospel that I think maybe better speaks to our current environment. Remember, this is just one way. God created people, but they rejected him and wanted independence. People were not created to be independent. So evil forces took God's place and began to oppress and enslave them. People live unaware that they're spiritually enslaved, and as a result live in shame and anxiety and depression and guilt. But God sent Jesus to free us from these powers through his death. On the cross, the evil powers go into Jesus, thinking that they're going to kill him, thinking that they have won. But what they don't realize is that when he dies, their power dies with him. And it's through this act of love and humility of God and Jesus working together that people become freed from their spiritual enslavement and now can be reconciled with God. Yet this reconciliation, it isn't enforced. God doesn't force people to love him. And for those who choose to not accept this gift from Jesus, they remain enslaved, which ultimately ends in separation from God for eternity. And since God is the source of everything good, then separation from everything good would be hell. This description of the gospel is generally called Christus Victor, Christ the victor. It emphasizes the resurrection, in my opinion, just as much as it emphasizes the death of Jesus. And I believe that it speaks more directly to the deepest longings of people in America today, because its emphasis is on freedom from these oppressive things in our lives, rather than just erasing guilt or a moralistic view of sin. It shows that sin is a power that has controlled us and enslaved us without us knowing. And it's only through Jesus' act of love and sacrifice that we're able to be broken free, that the chains that held us down can be taken off and dropped to the floor. If you've ever seen the movie The Matrix, it's literally this concept in movie form. People are living life without realizing that they're enslaved by this computer program, by these evil robots. Neo, who is supposed to be the Jesus figure, he goes into the computer program, like Jesus going to Earth, and he starts freeing people. And then he lets Agent Smith, who's the villain, basically the Satan character, jump inside of him at the end to kill him. But even though he thinks he's gonna die, and that Agent Smith thinks he's gonna kill Neo, what happens is that both of them die together. The death of Neo also kills Agent Smith in the same way that the death of Jesus also breaks the power of sin, Satan, and death. And then Neo comes back to life, which is obviously just like Jesus coming back to life in the resurrection. If you've never seen The Matrix, I probably just lost you, but maybe it's worth a watch. It's a sci-fi movie, good movie from the late 90s. But remember, there are even more ways of understanding the gospel than this. And I think if we started to see how there are more aspects of the gospel that speak directly to the needs of the people in our lives, we would be more likely to actually share it with other people.